Very good, thank you. Thanks everybody for being here today. Thanks for having me. As Chris mentioned, we're going to be talking about poultry mortality today, mortality management. For a little bit of context, a little bit of background, we usually look to the Chesapeake Bay Program's website here, and it mentions, as you guys know, the importance of the ag industry to the Delmarva Peninsula can't be overstated. One of the impacts of that is, in this case, when they talk about manure being applied to cropland, they say that it accounts for 90% of the nutrients on the eastern shore. But what the public doesn't realize often when we're at these conferences is that that manure that's being land applied is not just the manure, it's also that bedding material, and it's also those composted dead birds. So when you hear about in the news, on the TV or in the newspaper, and they're always talking about this evil manure that's being spread everywhere, you know, the concept of the manure being spread on the fields is much more than just the chicken manure. The reason why this is important is because it has been overlooked for years, and yet there's actually a large amount of material that's generated through composting. Right now, our current estimates are somewhere between 75,000 tons to 100,000 tons each year. Now, that data is not actually published, so we sort of had to reverse engineer some of that data to find out what the impact is. That number, those numbers there are for Delmarva, the entire peninsula. Now, a little history here. So 25, 30 years ago, mortality management on poultry farm, largely pit burial. And it's just what it sounds like. There was a large hole out behind the chicken house, and you walked the houses daily and then dropped your birds in the hole when you were done. About 25 or so years ago, the industry had to make a change. There was a concern about what impact would that burying of the dead have on both groundwater resources and also surface water resources. If you had a big rain event, everything came up and went down to your neighbor's yard. At that time, the industry looked at a couple of different options. Here on the peninsula, a lot of the folks, probably some of the folks in the room here, associated with ag extension and with the universities, did a lot of research on composting as an alternative to pit burial. So it's on some level, we locally here sort of started down that path. At the very same time, though, other parts of the country, Alabama, Georgia, Arkansas, and Texas, actually went directly to freezing mortality on the farms. I'm sure you all are very familiar with composting, the process. If it's done properly, it is time consuming. It does require, you know, some management. You have to take its temperature. You have to make sure that that compost pile gets hot enough to kill the pathogens. You don't want it to get too hot that it becomes a fire hazard. At the same time, too, because we're talking about carcasses, the composting often attracts insects and scavenger animals, an issue particularly of late with biosecurity. We're basically inviting these animals on to our farms, and what they bring with them, who knows. When it's properly done, composting ends up in a nutrient-rich material that can be land applied. And that's probably a problem here, particularly in Maryland, where we had the phosphorus management tool that was recently put into place. Because land application relies on having the land to apply, as that phosphorus management tool and other regulations in Maryland and other states as well starts to reduce that land mass. If we start out with this amount of land to land apply, and then the phosphorus management tool says, well, you know what, we're going to have to shrink that a little bit. This farm over here isn't able to accept land applied manure or mortality anymore. So that's kind of an issue going forward for composting, because the necessary second step of composting is land application. There is no alternative use. You can't go to the mushroom farms in Pennsylvania with it. Why? Because you and I eat those mushrooms, and we don't want to have bird parts in there. The same is true with a lot of the manure to energy or other projects like that. Even the pelletizing plant that Purdue used to operate would not be benefited by the mortality. Get in there and muddy up the works. As far as alternative uses go, there's nowhere else to go but land application. But what's interesting is that even land application is actually not a preferred thing if you talk to some of the crop farmers. So as you saw that earlier photograph with land application, birds that are not fully composted at some point actually start to clog up the spreader. The other issue is inconsistent nutrient content. The composting process itself, you have 2 parts manure and 1 part bird. At the end of that process, the material is often lower in nitrogen and higher in phosphorus than actual pure litter. So in some senses, we're actually creating kryptonite in these composting sheds, because the N is generally what the farmers are looking for, and the P is generally what we're scared to add more to the bag. The same is true with precision ag. As you know, we're doing the GPS every little inch of our farm fields to make sure that we're applying exactly the right amount of nutrients that we need. Because compost is inconsistent in its nutrient content, you can plan all day long for that, but if the material that you're spreading is not consistent, then you've sort of ruined your effort. One other issue too, as related to crop farming, is that compost generally has to be segregated in your manure storage shed. Because of the moisture difference between the compost and the pure litter, it's a potential fire hazard. So by removing compost from your farm and your storage shed, you actually get to reclaim some of that storage space for the pure litter. So as you can see here, this is specially designed equipment that was actually designed and patented by Tyson 20-so years ago. So this is not a chest freezer from Home Depot that's been retrofitted for this purpose. These things were designed specifically to hold dead broiler chickens. We size each of the farms based on the size of the flock and the ultimate market size of the birds, which I'll show you in a minute. And so, for instance, this farm here may need 6 freezer units. A truck arrives at the end of the flock. So generally, the collection occurs between flocks during the layout period. Obviously, the point there is to reduce that vehicular traffic, another biosecurity benefit. The specialized Moffett forklift is actually able to turn the boxes 360 degrees, emptying them into this off-haul trailer. Same trailer that Purdue and Mount Air and all those guys use to move their leftovers from processing to the rendering plant. Same truck. The only difference is we have this fancy forklift. Rendering plant. That material all goes to the rendering plant. Rendering, it's a high heat, high pressure cooking process. At the end of that process, we have 3 things. We have water, which is largely lost as steam. We have a protein meal and a poultry fat. And what's fascinating is each of those is sold on the commodities market, just like a bushel of soybeans or corn. So as those market prices fluctuate, the value of corn and soybeans fluctuate, the value of the rendered products also fluctuates. Some of the uses for those end products, for the poultry fat, a couple of different uses, one of which is actually as a feedstock for biofuel. So you actually can make biodiesel out of that. So it really is recycling. We're turning something that's sort of a waste product into something of value. With regard to the protein meal, that can also be used for like aquaculture. Think about the fish flakes in your fish tank at home. That's just protein meal that you're feeding your fish. So there's a lot of really good end uses for this material that would otherwise be composted and land applied. Another big distinction here, very helpful on the nutrient side, is that there is no second step. So this material is removed entirely from the farm setting and recycled at a plant. Most of the other mortality management methods, composting, biodigestion, incineration, each of those achieves a large portion of what the goal was, but there's always a second step. Composting ends in land application. Incineration, you reduce the volume of the material down to 10%, but all of that phosphorus is still in that ash, and then we land apply it. Same thing as with biodigestion. I'm not as up on science behind biodigestion, but again, at the end of that process, there's a sludge, which many of those nutrients are still trapped in, and then that gets land applied. So what makes this so different, and the reason why I focus on this is because I'm going to show you some cost effectiveness numbers in a minute, and you're going to say, wow, that's a really crazy big number, but it's because the material is dealt with 100%. I'll figure this out, I promise. I mentioned this earlier, so I'm not an early adopter, so when the new iPhone comes out, I'm waiting, making sure everything's working before I go out and buy that. So I understand there's some reluctance to be like, this is sort of this new gadget, this new gizmo. But in reality, as I mentioned before, this has been around for more than 2 decades. Again, Tyson designed and patented. It's been in use for more than 2 decades in other parts of the country. It is a recognized management practice under NRCS Practice Code 316, which also means it's eligible for cost share through the EQIP program. One of the benefits of this nutrient management, mortality management method is that the results are much more specific than with some of the other BMPs that we put in place. So for example, because we go to the rendering plant, we literally get a weight ticket from the rendering plant. So the trucks weighed on the way in and on the way out. So we actually know how much material was removed from the ag sector. then we can apply a formula. We know how much nitrogen and phosphorus there is in a pound of broiler chicken. So it's very easy, it's math, there's no fuzziness. So if you have a vegetative buffer or some other very important BMPs, but the N and P impact that you're getting from some of these other BMPs can change. Cover crops. You could plant an acre of cover crops here and go right up the road a mile and plant another acre of the same cover crop. You're not going to get the exact same results from each of these because of site conditions. So this is one of the benefits, particularly from a budgetary issue, of trying to pay for and fund nutrient management practices. This is on that side of the scale where we really know what we're getting, what bang for the buck we're getting. The practice was also recently given interim BMP status, which allows the states, Delaware, Maryland, and everyone else to use this practice as part of their planning for their next watershed implementation plan. This is what I was alluding to earlier. We had someone, an outside consultant, do this research for us. It went and took the data from the 2011, 2007 Inland Bay study. What they did in that Inland Bay study, they actually took the data from all the different various BMPs and aggregated it into one location and sort of given you like a menu of options. So we had that data taken and actually plugged into this chart, and the freezer units are at the top there, as you can see. This chart is specific to phosphorus removal. And of course, like I said earlier, I look at that chart and I go, wow, that really seems like a big number that's, you know, hard to believe. But the point is that it's entirely removing that material from the farm setting. There is no second step land application, so all that NP is being removed. When we first did this research, you know, we focused on how much more cost effective, 80%, 90%, but what we realized was the better way to do this would be doing a bar chart and actually considering, you know, what state, federal agencies or nonprofits are out there working. If you had $1 million, how much impact could you have? We did the same thing with nitrogen. So 45 to 50% there. Cover crops are important on this one as well. And it's also important to point out that cover crops and other BMPs, but cover crops in particular, are important for the separate benefit of sediment control. So that's an equally important goal. So how do we size a farm? We actually take the flock size. It's going to work, is it? No. So we take the flock size. Farmer comes in and says, this is how many birds I'm growing, 75,000 birds. Grow them for 49 days, so we're looking at a finished bird weight of about 6.5 pounds. So those two factors right there are plugged into this model. This whole calculator here is based on the AgriStats data for this region. So AgriStats, so that you guys are familiar with it, is basically a subscription service for the large integrators that they plug in their own data and they keep it confidential. And it's put into a black box. But what the benefit of that is that they can each see what the rest of the competitors are doing. You can't see any one specific data. But the side benefit to that is we actually have all that data aggregated in one place. So I say that because this is literally going to be, thanks, Chris. So instead of having sort of a best guess rule of thumb as far as mortality goes, we literally know that during week 1, 1.19% is the mortality rate for this region. The same thing for each of these other weeks. So those are then divided by 7 and actually give us our daily mortality rates. We have the bird growth weight by day for this area. And so using those two numbers, we can actually calculate how much capacity is needed for this farm. This farm with a 75,000 bird flock grown to 6.5 pounds needs 4 freezer units. So it actually starts out, it needs 3.45. We add 15% cushion. You're going to have some variability from flock to flock, so we want to make sure that you're covered. And then you take that number and you round it up and you end up with 4 units. One of the questions we get often is about power consumption. Like, well, you're going to have 4 freezers out there in the sun. Is it going to cost a lot to power those? Well, it turns out that's not the case. Here, we actually, and I should point out that this calculator was done with a lot of assistance from the NRCS in Delaware. Some of the original work we did, but some of these big benefits, such as this, were done by the team in Delaware, in the Delaware office. So specifically, what we did was we took the cost of the power consumption and ran it out over that calculator there. This farm that needs 4 freezer units, $91 per flock. That's not per month, that's not per freezer, that's for the whole flock all in. So the reason why that is because of when the freezers come on and when they're turned off. So if you think about it, the bird size during the first 3 or 4 weeks is so small, you really don't need that much capacity. So with respect to this specific farm, that first unit, this farmer did not have to turn on the second freezer unit until week 5. At which point, if you stop using freezer 1, it's like your freezer at home. If it's full and you don't open the door, it doesn't need to power, it doesn't need to be cycled on that often to maintain the cold. So for those reasons, you end up with a very, very minor amount of power consumption. The other part that we added to this with the NRCS's help was the actual nitrogen and phosphorus benefits. We literally can tell that grower that comes in and says, hey, I have 75,000 bird flock, I grow 6.5 pounds on an annual basis. This grower is going to be diverting from land application 956 pounds of nitrogen and 128 pounds of phosphorus. So it's pretty cool to be able to actually see that. Plug in that number and on that very day say, hey, this is what you're looking at going forward for nutrient management. One of the other, the emphasis recently through the Bay program is that they want to know that all those BMPs that we put out in the field, because they've been doing that for 10 or 12, 15 years now, are all those BMPs actually giving us the benefits that we thought we were going to get? So verification is sort of a buzzword right now with the Bay program folks. So one of the other benefits of this, as opposed to some of the other BMPs, is that because it does, basically as part of the farm and we have those weight tickets, there's no need to be concerned, is that still being utilized? Is that BMP still being implemented? How much bang for our buck are we getting from that BMP? Because all that will be recorded and tracked. As far as operational savings, so a grower, if properly composting, is going to spend a lot of time. It requires a little bit of work, requires a little bit of management. You have to pay attention to it. Again, we had an outside consultant do a little bit of work for us using the labor statistics, manual labor versus equipment operator for the front end loader and things like that, so that on average, the Delmarva farm can realize a couple $1,000s a year in operational savings. That specific farm, that 4 freezer unit farm we're just looking at, was $1,600 a year based on mostly labor, but also diesel and maintenance on the front end loader. And I should say that that savings is after factoring power consumption and also a collection fee, which we'll talk about in a minute. Another aspect of this is improved quality of life. I'm sure you guys have all seen in the news that a lot of folks have been moving to the area. They want to live in a rural area, and then they're a little upset if there's a farm nearby and either the farm wants to expand or add different operations. So as you've seen in the newspaper and heard on the TV news, a lot of folks go to the county boards now or the zoning boards and try to get additional setbacks or other restrictions on poultry operations. Often it's the case that to some degree the complaints that you're hearing are about the smells or about the flies or about the buzzards and those sorts of things. So between switching to freezers and putting up a vegetative buffer between the farm and the residents nearby, they wouldn't even know that there was a farm operating on the other side. So there are ways to address these issues without creating more regulation and more burden on the ag community. The last thing I wanted to talk about today was the improved biosecurity. We mentioned it earlier a little bit, that the fact that, you know, a composting shed is to a large degree an open air food source. I mean, if you feed your cats on your back step at your house, you're going to end up with raccoons in your yard. It's just, you know, human nature, raccoon nature. So in this case, we're basically creating an open air food source. So, you know, shouldn't be shocked that we're actually attracting these animals to our farms. I do want to show you. where these potential vectors are and the attraction to the farms, we've reduced our risk. So 2 points on that. One is you're reducing your risk to your farm because you're not attracting more animals. The second benefit, though, is if for some reason, and I'm not talking about AI, we're talking about all forms of virus, LT, any of these things, all those animals transmit those things from farm to farm. So if we can reduce, thanks, Chris. So if we can reduce this pathway, we're going to reduce the risk for this farm. This is sort of what I was just touching on. These animals here visit this waterway each day. This is the same waterway that migratory waterfowl are probably going to be visiting. And then you ultimately, without realizing it, you've tracked it into the house. The opposite effect there is that you're also preventing the spread of disease. And again, I'm not talking about AI here, just talking about LT or something else that's localized. The chance of that being spread from one farm to a neighbor's farm is much greater if those animals are traveling back and forth. But if that first farm that has gone hot with some sort of virus, if all that material is locked in a lockbox, then the scavengers are not coming to get it, and then they're not going to walk it across the street to the farmer in the neighboring area. So it both serves as a function to reduce risk to that primary farm, but it also reduces the chance of if something goes wrong, that material is sort of locked in a box and it reduces the ability for it to spread. We've got a little time for questions, right?
Is that your last slide?
Yes. Yep.
All right. With that, we'll take some questions.
You converted, let's say, 50% of all our poultry production of Delaware right now to the freezer unit. Is there enough rendering capacity?
Good question. Yes, there is. And in fact, what I've learned recently about rendering is that while rendering is the process, a large part of that business model is logistics. So, and the reason, let me explain it this way. So each part of that bird has a different value. So the industry, right, so the white meat stays in the US, the dark meat goes to Russia, the chicken feet go to China. They found somebody to buy every part of that bird, but what's left over is the offal, OFFAL. That offal and the dead birds, the ones that don't survive from being and processing plant, all of that material is segregated and then sent to the rendering plant. Now, back to your question though. So each part of that bird, the bones are not very valuable to the rendering plant. So what they do is they segregate each of those parts and send them to different plants. So my point about the logistics is they have access to plants all over the mid-Atlantic, and they already do this packaging and sort of sending to each different plant depending on what the output's going to be. So some plants are actually pet food grade plants where they're actually putting the offal in pet food. Other plants are feed grade plants. But each case, a large part of that business is literally inputs and outputs. They get the material and they know where to go with it. As far as the rendering plant in Linkwood that you guys may be familiar with, it's actually under expansion right now. And that's one of our rendering partners that we work with is that plant. And so they've actually taken into consideration the growth of this practice as they're planning their expansion at that facility. But even beyond that facility, they have, right now, a lot of this material is actually being sent down to Virginia, Winchester, Linville area, as is, even before that other expansion comes online. It's a good question, though.
You mentioned the pickup fee.
Yes, thank you.
Where's that?
So the collection fee. So the benefit of the rendering plant being the destination point is that it is a valuable source. So the rendering plant renders the material and sells those end products. And what does that mean? That means that we largely, with the exception of like twice over the last 3.5 years, don't have to pay for disposal. And what does that mean? That means the grower then doesn't have to also pay for that disposal. So for instance, often when we go to the plant, it's a very small amount of money that the value of the material, but we're not paying a tipping fee as if we had to go to a landfill. So that collection fee that you're asking about is literally just covering the cost of the truck, the hauling from the farm to the rendering plant. And it's based on 2 factors. Mileage, which is pretty simple to understand. A farm that's twice as far away is going to have a higher collection fee. And also the number of freezer units on that farm. The number of freezer units is basically a proxy for how long the guy has to be on your farm. So if you have 4 freezer units, the guy's going to be there 20 minutes. If you have 8, he might be there, 60 minutes. It just depends. But that's where that proxy, and that's how that formula is determined. On an average basis, I'm going to guess about $300.
Per farm, yeah.
Yeah, obviously the farther away farm might be 400, and the one that's up the street's 150, but
Per year?
per flock. So that would be, on average, on Delmarva, it's about 5.2 flocks per year. Yeah. Yeah.
On average, how many units is that?
The average number of units on farms?
Yeah, for that $300.
Oh, the average is, yeah, what mileage also plays into it too.
Right.
The average farm, though, is about 11 units right now. But you realize that that's the average, so there's going to be somebody with 30 and there's going to be somebody with 3, but yeah, the average is 11 units. So,
How long do they last?
sure. So,
Repeat the question, Rick.
yes, okay, so the maintenance on the equipment and how long the equipment will last. So I imagine because it's also a mortality management practice under Practice Code 16 and composting sheds, others like have a 15-year practice life is what that is. We do know that in other parts of the country that these boxes have lasted longer than that. The box, where such a degree that when the freezer component had trouble on it and the grower would go back in to cost share new boxes, they actually determined that that really wasn't a need for that, and they split the freezer component from the box as 2 separate MPs, so to speak, for purposes of that. So those boxes last a lot longer than 15 years. As far as maintenance goes, it is the responsibility of the grower. Generally, if you think about it, they're frozen, feathered birds that when they come out of the box, they're usually, sorry, you led me there. So generally, there's not a lot of mess to deal with. However, yeah, I mean, you're talking about maybe a gallon of water, rinse it out. If you want to, you can put a 10% bleach solution in there or something. Yeah.
But if a freezer unit were to go out?
Oh, okay, the warranty, yeah. So there's a warranty on the unit. I'm going to get this wrong. 1 year warranty on the entire thing, and there's a 5-year warranty on the compressor, the freezer component compressor. Thanks, Sydney.
Go ahead.
How heavy are each one of the freezer units empty?
Empty?
They're a couple hundred pounds, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know.
Yeah, I can get back to you with that. We have a spec sheet that's got that. We have that documented because within the shed, generally, we require that the freezer top be on a winch system. And the idea there is that you literally undo the latches on the top half. Let me see if I can find it. It'd be easier to show you. Oh, there we go. So basically, you got a big box, big heavily insulated box. The R factor is like 13 or something on this. And so the top rests on the bottom. There's these latches. This cabling system here allows the top, once you pop the latches, allows the top to be lifted, which then allows the forklift to come in, take the bottom, put it back, empty it, and put it right back in place. So the box itself is 365 pounds, and the freezer is 200 pounds. So looking at 565 total.
What's the typical price for one of the units?
So right now it's $52.25 per freezer. So if you go back to that farm we looked at earlier, you're looking at about $20,000 for those 4 freezers. Oh, and that reminds me too, though. This is a new shed that was built for these, but it's also possible to retrofit a bin composter to save on that if you have a bin composter, or I guess a channel composter, but in this case, this is a bin composter with the walls cut out here, and be able to reuse that. Oh, sorry.
What
What do you recommend as a plan B on operations that only have the freezer units if you have a high mortality event that overwhelms your system?
So we've had that happen on 2 occasions. There was a farm that had LT, and so I can't remember, I think they lost like 20 or almost 30% of their flock. So while obviously he was not happy about losing 20 or 30% of his flock, he was very happy that we could come and cart it away for him, because the prior time, 5 or 6 years earlier, he had LT. It took him more than 18 months and lots of space to compost all those birds. But from a process thing, so if you get to that point and you're having trouble, we can come mid-flock and if all your boxes are full. And in that case, you would be the first or the only farm we'd go to that day. But that brings me to another thing. So biosecurity-wise, so let's say that something happens bad. So let's say there's a farm that goes hot. Maybe we can even talk about AI just to make it extreme. Nothing changes from farm A to farm B. Farm A has composting, farm B uses freezers. The same thing happens. The state vet quarantines that farm. All those birds are depopulated. All that manure in the manure shed and the compost shed is dragged back into the chicken houses. The feed is dragged back into the chicken houses. Anything like that is dragged back into the chicken houses to be composted in-house. Same thing over here with the freezers. The quarantine team, not the company, the quarantine team that does this over here is the same team that on this farm empties the freezers and moves all that material and the manure and the feed back into the chicken houses. So there's no difference between those two.
How many birds actually fit into a freezer? You know, I would say full-grown birds, just to put it onto a.
Yeah.
It's hard to get a scale.
Well, that's it, is that, depending on the size, the age of the bird. So, when we were talking about earlier, the first 5 weeks could handle all, from biddies all the way up. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know the exact number of birds at a particular weight.
The box is, how big? Is that a 5 by 5?
Oh, so it's 40 cubic feet. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a calculation on the calculator that will tell you how many pounds of birds, the box down.
It's
How many birds.
45 pounds per cubic foot.
All right. Any other questions? Going once? Going twice? All right. Thank you, Victor.